Miss Marple cracks the Crimson Chalice Mystery Asterisk Chapter 1. The Invitation to Langley Hall. Autumn wind swept through St. Mary's Hollow, rustling the golden leaves that blanketed the cobblestone paths. Miss Jane Marple, her woolen shawl draped over her shoulders, stepped off the train at the village station, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. She had received a letter from Lady Eleanor Langley, an old acquaintance from her days at a London charity board, inviting her to Langley Hall for the unveiling of the Crimson Chalice, a medieval artifact rumored to hold mystical powers. The invitation had piqued her curiosity, not for the chalice's supposed magic, but for the undercurrent of urgency in Eleanor's elegant handwriting. Langley Hall stood at the edge of the village, its ivy-clad towers and mullioned windows casting long shadows over manicured lawns. As Miss Marple approached, the air carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, a reminder of the season's turn. Eleanor greeted her at the grand oak doors, her silver hair impeccably styled, but her smile strained. "Jane, how kind of you to come," she said, her voice warm yet tinged with unease. Inside, the hall's polished floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and portraits of stern-faced Langleys lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow the guests. Eleanor introduced. The others gathered for the event: Sir Rupert Langley, her older brother, a man with a ruddy complexion and a brusque manner; Clara Beaumont, a young historian with ink-stained fingers and a nervous habit of adjusting her glasses; Dr. Felix Mortimer, an archaeologist whose tweed jacket bore traces of chalk dust; and Victor Crane, an art dealer whose charming smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The group assembled in the drawing room, where a glass case held the Crimson Chalice, its ruby-encrusted surface glinting in the candlelight. Eleanor explained its history, a gift to the Langleys from a 15th century knight, while Miss Marple noted the guests' reactions, Victor's lingering gaze, Clara's fidgeting, and Rupert's impatient side-dot. As dinner progressed, the conversation turned to the chalice's legend, which claimed it brought prosperity to its keepers but doom to thieves. Dr. Mortimer, his voice low, recounted tales of vanished owners, while Clara scribbled notes. Miss Marple, sipping her soup, observed the dynamics: Rupert's disdain for Victor, Eleanor's attempts to keep peace, and Clara's avoidance of Dr. Mortimer's questions. Later, as the guests retired, Miss Marple lingered in the hall, her fingers tracing the banister's carvings. A distant creak caught her ear, but the corridor was empty. At midnight, a scream shattered the silence. Miss Marple, roused from her room, joined the others in the library, where Eleanor stood pale before the glass case. The Crimson Chalice was gone, the case still locked, its key safe in the butler's possession. Inspector Harrow, summoned from the village, arrived with a notebook and a frown. As he questioned the guests, Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, noting a faint scratch on the case and a misplaced candlestick. Her knitting needles, tucked in her bag, would weight this puzzle required her full attention. Chapter 2. The locked room puzzle dawn broke over Langley Hall, painting the mist-covered lawns in hues of gold and gray. Miss Marple, an early riser, stood by her window, watching rooks circle the chimneys. The theft of the Crimson Chalice had cast a pall over the household, and breakfast was a tense affair. Sir Rupert glowered over his coffee, muttering about incompetent staff, while Eleanor twisted her napkin, her eyes darting to the library door. Clara, pale and silent, pushed her eggs around her plate, and Victor's easy banter felt forced. Dr. Mortimer, nursing a headache, spoke little, his gaze fixed on the tablecloth. Inspector Harrow, a man with a methodical air and a slightly rumpled suit, had set up in the library, where the empty glass case stood under a portrait of Lord Edmund Langley, the chalice's first keeper. The lock was intact, its mechanism unforced, and the room's only window was bolted from within, the latch rusted with age. Harrow dusted for fingerprints, finding only smudges, and questioned the butler, Mr. Gibbs, who swore the key had never left his waistcoat. Miss Marple, invited to observe, sat in a corner, her knitting needles clicking softly as she listened. She examined the case herself, her frail fingers tracing the scratch she'd noticed the previous night. It was shallow, barely visible, yet deliberate, suggesting a tool finer than a knife. The candlestick, oddly positioned on a shelf rather than its usual table, bore a faint wax strip, as if moved in haste. Miss Marple questioned Gibbs, a stooped man with a loyal demeanor, who mentioned seeing a shadow in the corridor before the theft. "It was fleeting, miss," he said, like someone who knew the hall's corners. Harrow interrogated the guests, starting with Victor, whose alibi a solitary walk in the gardens lacked corroboration. Clara claimed she'd been in her room, transcribing notes, but her trembling hands betrayed her. Dr. Mortimer, still shaken, admitted to wandering the cellars, chasing rumors of a hidden vault. Sir Rupert, indignant, insisted he'd been asleep, though his valet hesitated when confirming it. Eleanor, wringing her hands, vouched for the staff, but admitted the family's finances were strained, a fact Rupert dismissed with a scowl. Miss Marple, sipping tea in the drawing room, pondered. The locked room puzzle. The scratch suggested tampering, but the intact lock pointed to an inside job. She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, where a clever maid had used a hairpin to bypass a lock. As the household dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the library, her eyes on the portrait of Lord Edmund. His stern gaze seemed to guard a secret, and she wondered if the chalice's disappearance was less about its value and more about what it concealed. Chapter 3. Shadows in the past, morning mist clung to the rolling hills of St. Mary's Hollow, veiling Langley Hall in a gauzy shroud that softened stern towers. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl wrapped tightly against the autumn chill, strolled through the estate's rose garden, where the last blooms of the season drooped under dew. The garden, a labyrinth of gravel paths and thorny arches, was a quiet haven from the tension within the hall, and Miss Marple's sensible shoes crunched softly as she moved, her knitting bag slung over her arm. She had chosen this spot deliberately, having noticed Clara Beaumont sketching there earlier, her pencil flying over a notebook with an intensity that suggested more than idle doodling. Clara, perched on a wrought iron bench, started as Miss Marple approached, her glasses slipping down her nose. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't hear you," she said, snapping her notebook shut. Her auburn hair, usually neatly penned, was loose, and her fingers bore fresh ink stains, a testament to her restless night. Miss Marple, settling beside her, offered a gentle smile, her eyes sharp behind their kindly veneer. "You seem quite absorbed, my dear," she said, her voice soft as the rustling leaves. "The roses are lovely, but I suspect your sketches are of something more substantial." Clara hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. Miss Marple, sensing her unease, steered the conversation to safer ground, asking about the history of Langley Hall. Clara, grateful for the reprieve, explained her research. The Crimson Chalice, a ruby-encrusted goblet, had been gifted to the Langleys in 1423 by a knight named Sir Alaric, betrayed by the family in a land dispute. "The legend says he cursed the chalice," Clara said, her voice low, claiming it would bring ruin to any who stole it. Her words faltered, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of fear in her eyes, as if the curse weighed on her more than she admitted, pressing gently. Miss Marple asked about Clara's interest in the chalice. "It's my thesis," Clara said, pushing her glasses up, "but it's costly books, travel, archives. I've borrowed to keep going." Her admission, halting and reluctant, hinted at debts, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the pressures that might drive a young scholar to desperate acts. "Debts can be a heavy burden," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic, especially when others know of them. Clara's cheeks flushed and she looked away, confirming Miss Marple's suspicion that her financial strain was no secret among the guests. Leaving Clara to her sketches, Miss Marple walked to St. Mary's Hollow, the village a mile from the hall. Its cobblestone streets wound past thatched cottages and a stone church, their chimneys puffing smoke into the gray sky. The air carried the scent of baking bread and wet leaves, and villagers nodded as she passed, their eyes curious about the stranger from Wrenley Hall. At the Rose and Crown, a tea shop with lace curtains and mismatched china, Miss Marple settled at a corner table, where Mrs. Finch, the postmistress, poured chamomile tea and shared village gossip. The Langleys are, in a bad way, Mrs. Finch said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. Sir Rupert's been gambling cards, horses, you name it. Owes half of London, they say. She leaned closer, her apron rustling. And Lady Eleanor's late husband, God rest him, was mad for that chalice. Spent a fortune chasing its secrets, left her with nothing but debts. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap, and encouraged Mrs. Finch to continue. The postmistress obliged, mentioning rumors of a hidden vault beneath the hall, said to hold treasures from the Langleys' medieval past. No one's seen it, she added, but old Mr. Tate, the historian, swears it's real. Intrigued, Miss Marple visited Mr. Tate's cottage, a cluttered haven of books and maps at the village's edge. The historian, a wiry man with ink-stained fingers, welcomed her with a cup of weak tea and a stack of records. He showed her a 17th century map of Wrenley Hall, its parchment brittle but legible, marking a sealed chamber beneath the cellars. The Langleys guarded something more than the chalice, he said, his eyes gleaming. A relic, perhaps, or proof of their dealings with Sir Alaric. The map's carvings matched Clara's sketches, and Miss Marple, thanking Mr. Tate, tucked the detail away, her mind buzzing with possibilities. Back at Wrenley Hall, the atmosphere was strained, the theft's shadow lengthening with each hour. Inspector Harrow, his notebook filled with scribbles, reported that Victor Crane had been seen near the library before the chalice vanished. Confronted in the drawing room, Victor lounged in an armchair, his smile unruffled. I was admiring the portraits, he said, his voice smooth as polished wood. The Langleys have exquisite taste. Miss Marple, seated by the fire, noted his casual dismissal of the chalice's value, odd for an art dealer who thrived on rare artifacts. His boots, she observed, bore traces of garden mud, suggesting he'd been outside more than he claimed Dottet. Luncheon, the dining room's long table gleamed with silver, but the mood was dour. Sir Rupert, his face flushed, argued with Eleanor about the estate's future. We can't keep this crumbling pile, he snapped, his knife clattering against his plate. Sell it and be done. Eleanor, her hands trembling, pleaded for patience, her voice barely audible over the clink of glassware. Miss Marple, eating her soup, watched their exchange, her thoughts on Mrs. Finch's gossip, Rupert's debts, and Eleanor's loyalty, too. The family legacy suggested motives for the theft, but the chalice's curse loomed larger, its legend weaving through every conversation. That evening, as the household gathered in the conservatory, a groundskeeper burst in, his face pale. Dr. Mortimer's been hurt, he gasped. Found him by the stables, knocked cold with a stone. The group rushed out, the night air sharp with frost. Dr. Mortimer lay on the straw-strewn ground, a bloodied stone beside him, his tweed jacket torn. Revived with brandy, he muttered about an unseen attacker, his eyes darting to the shadows. Miss Marple, kneeling by the stable door, found hoofprints in the mud and a torn scrap of cloth, its blue weave matching Clara's shawl. The cloth, caught on a nail, was damp, as if torn recently, and Miss Marple slipped it into her pocket. her knitting needles still as she considered the implications. Back in the hall, Eleanor fussed over Dr. Mortimer while Sir Rupert demanded, "Harrow, arrest the culprit." Clara, pale as moonlight, avoided Miss Marple's gaze, her hands twisting her shawl. Victor, offering to fetch a doctor, seemed too eager to leave, and Miss Marple noted his glance at Clara, a silent communication. She couldn't yet decipher. Inspector Harrow, scribbling in his notebook, promised a thorough search, but Miss Marple knew the stables held more than evidence of an attack. They were a stage, set to distract or warn Dot as the household retired. Miss Marple sat in her room, the fire casting flickering shadows on the wallpaper. She spread the cloth on her table, its threads confirming her suspicion. Clara had been near the stables, but why? The attack on Dr. Mortimer, the map's fault, and the chalice's curse formed a tapestry, its pattern incomplete but emerging. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead gardener attacked to silence his eavesdropping and wondered if Mortimer's obsession with the chalice had made him a target. Her knitting resumed, the needle's rhythm a counterpoint to her thoughts. The Langley past, she sensed, held the key, its shadows stretching far beyond the hall's walls. Chapter 4. The Historian's Secret. Dawn light filtered through Langley Hall's leaded windows, casting diamond patterns on the oak-paneled corridors. Miss Jane Marple, awake before the household, sipped tea in her room, her knitting bag open beside her. The attack on Dr. Felix Mortimer had deepened the mystery, and the torn cloth from Clara's shawl weighed heavily in her thoughts. She dressed in her usual tweed skirt and cardigan, her sensible shoes silent on the rugs, and made her way to the guest wing, where Dr. Mortimer was recovering under Eleanor's care. The archaeologist's room smelled of liniment and wood smoke, its four-poster bed dwarfing his frail form. A bandage wrapped his head, and his tweed jacket hung on a chair, its torn sleeve a reminder of the stables. Miss Marple, settling beside him, offered a knitted shawl for warmth, her gesture disarming. "You've had quite a fright, Dr. Mortimer," she said, her voice gentle. "Perhaps you can tell me what drew you to the stables so late?" Mortimer, his eyes clouded, admitted to exploring the estate, chasing rumors of the chalice's origins. "It's more than a goblet," he said, his voice hoarse. "The Langleys hid something, documents, relics proving their medieval power." Miss Marple, noting his fervor, probed further, asking about his attacker. Mortimer recalled only a shadow and a sudden blow, his memory blurred by pain. His hands, clutching the blanket, trembled, and Miss Marple wondered if fear, not injury, shook him. Thanking him, she left, her thoughts on his obsession. The chalice, she sensed, was a symbol, its true value tied to what it concealed. Outside, the stable yard was a churn of mud and straw, the morning frost melted by the sun. Miss Marple, her umbrella shielding her from a light drizzle, examined the scene. The bloodied stone, now in Harrow's custody, had been smooth, suggesting it was chosen, not random. The hoof prints, deep and scattered, indicated a horse's. Panic, and the nail where the cloth caught gleamed in the light. Miss Marple, crouching carefully, found a second clue, a pearl button, its sheen out of place in the muck. It resembled those on Clara's blouse, deepening her suspicion. In the library, Clara was transcribing manuscripts, her notebook open to a sketch of the chalice. Miss Marple, entering quietly, observed her tension, the way her pencil snapped. When startled, "You seem troubled, my dear," Miss Marple said, settling in a chair. "The stables are no place for sketching, yet you were there." Clara's eyes widened, and tears spilled as she confessed to wandering the grounds, claiming she was researching the estate's architecture. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her voice breaking. "Victor, he's been asking about my work, pressing me to share my notes." Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking, noted Clara's fear of Victor Crane. "He's a persuasive man," she said, "but persuasion can mask other intentions." Clara admitted Victor had offered to fund her research, a deal that felt like a trap. Her story, though tearful, held gaps, and Miss Marple suspected she knew more about the chalice's theft than she let on. Leaving Clara, Miss Marple slipped the pearl button into her pocket, its weight a reminder of the historian's secret dot at luncheon. The dining room's chandeliers cast a cold light over the guests. Sir Rupert, his temper frayed, announced a reward for the chalice's return, his voice echoing off the paneled walls. £10,000, he declared, ignoring Eleanor's gasp. Victor, sipping wine, offered to broker the chalice's sale if recovered, his smile smooth as ever. I have contacts in London, he said, discreet buyers. Miss Marple, eating her roast, watched their interplay, her mind on the button. And Clara's confession? Victor's offer, she sensed, was a gambit, designed to flush out the thief or cover his tracks. Inspector Harrow, joining the meal, reported progress. The stable boy had seen a cloaked figure near the attack, too fleeting to identify. His description, slight build, swift movements, could fit Clara or Victor, and Miss Marple noted Harrow's glance at the historian. After lunch, she explored the conservatory, its glass walls steaming with humidity. Among the ferns she found Clara's notebook left on a table, its pages open to a cryptic note. The false relic lies in shadow. The phrase, paired with the button, suggested Clara's role was more than scholarly, perhaps complicit in the theft. That evening, the household gathered in the drawing room, where a fire crackled against the autumn chill. Eleanor, pale but composed, played the piano, her notes faltering as Rupert paced. Victor, offering brandy, engaged Dr. Mortimer in talk of artifacts, while Clara sat apart, her shawl clutched tightly. Miss Marple, knitting in a corner, observed their dynamics. Rupert's anger, Eleanor's strain, Victor's charm, and Clara's fear. The button, she mused, was a thread, linking Clara to the stables, and perhaps the chalice dot as the night deepened. Miss Marple walked the corridors, her candle casting shadows on the portraits. A creak in the library drew her, but the room was empty, its glass case a silent taunt. She examined the candlestick, still misplaced, and found a wax strip on the floor, fresh and unmarred. Someone, she realized, had been here recently, perhaps, searching for clues or planning them. Her knitting resumed in her room, the needle's rhythm a counterpoint to her thoughts. Clara's secret, Mortimer's attack, and the chalice's disappearance were pieces of a puzzle, their edges sharp. With deceit, the Langley past, she sensed, held the key, its shadows lengthening with each revelation. Chapter 5. The Vault Beneath. Cellars of Langley Hall were a world apart from its polished halls, their stone walls slick with damp and their air heavy with the scent of earth and decay. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl tight against the chill, descended the narrow stairs, her hand steady on the iron railing. Lady Eleanor, persuaded by Miss Marple's quiet insistence, led the way, her lantern casting flickering shadows. Inspector Harrow followed, his boots echoing in the silence, a groundskeeper named Tom at his side with a crowbar. The map from Mr. Tate's cottage, etched in Miss Marple's memory, had pointed to a sealed chamber, and she was determined to uncover its secrets, the passages twisted like veins, their cobwebs brushing Miss Marple's face as she moved. Eleanor, her face pale, admitted the family avoided the cellars, fearing the chalice's curse. Father called it a tomb, she said, her voice trembling. He said the Langleys buried their shame here. Miss Marple, her eyes sharp in the dim light, noted Eleanor's fear, wondering if it stemmed from legend or truth. The air grew colder as they reached a stone door, its carvings worn but intricate, mirroring Clara's sketches. The symbols, crosses, vines, a knight's helm hinted at a medieval purpose, and Miss Marple traced them, her fingers chilled by the stone. Harrow, with Tom's help, pried the door open, its hinges groaning after centuries of silence. Vault beyond was a cavern of dust and shadow, its floor littered with relics, rusted swords, cracked pottery, and a wooden chest, its iron bands pitted with age. Miss Marple, stepping carefully, lifted a leather-bound journal from the chest. Its pages yellowed but intact. The script, faded but legible, described the Crimson Chalice as a peace offering to Sir Alaric. But a second chalice, hidden here, was the true treasure, guarded by a vow of silence. 2 goblets, Miss Marple murmured, one to dazzle, one to keep. As they catalogued the finds, a crash echoed above, shaking the cellar's dust. Rushing upstairs, they found the library's candelabrum overturned, its wax splattered on the rug. Victor Crane stood nearby, brushing ash from his coat, his smile sheepish. "Clumsy of me," he said, gesturing to the iron frame, tripped in the dark. Miss Marple, her eyes narrowing, noted his muddy boots and the faint scent of tobacco, matching the steps from the folly. His explanation, she sensed, was a lie designed to mask a search or sabotage. Harrow questioned Victor, who claimed he'd been reading, but the library's books were untouched, their dust undisturbed. Miss Marple, examining the candelabrum, found a fresh scratch on its base, as if struck deliberately. The journal, now in Harrow's custody, held clues to the chalice's twin, and Miss Marple memorized its key passages, her mind racing. Vault's discovery shifted the mystery. The stolen chalice was a replica, but who knew the truth? Clara's sketches, Victor's prowling, and Mortimer's attack suggested a race for the hidden relic, one the Langleys had guarded for centuries. Back in the drawing room, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking as the household gathered. Eleanor, shaken by the vault, spoke of her father's warnings, while Rupert scoffed, his face flushed with brandy. Clara, pale, avoided the journal's mention, her fingers twisting her shawl. Victor, offering to authenticate any finds, seemed too eager, and Dr. Mortimer, his bandage fresh, muttered about curses. Miss Marple, sipping tea, observed their interplay, her thoughts on the journal's guardian. Had Victor been in the library to find it or to ensure it stayed hidden? That evening, Miss Marple walked the gardens, the moon silvering the roses. A rustle in the hedge drew her, but it was only a fox, its eyes glinting. The vault, she mused, was a Pandora's box, its contents threatening the Langley legacy. Clara's fear, Victor's charm, and Rupert's desperation were threads in a tapestry, their pattern emerging with each clue. Her knitting resumed in her room, the needle's rhythm a steady pulse. The chalice's twin, she sensed, was the prize, its theft a spark in a web of greed and secrets. Chapter 6. A Murder in the Night. The moon hung low over Langley Hall, its light filtering through the leaded windows to cast eerie patterns on the walls. Miss Jane Marple, roused from sleep by a piercing cry, slipped on her dressing gown and hurried to the servants' quarters, her candle trembling in the draught. The corridor was alive with footsteps, and she joined the household in a cramped room, where a grim scene awaited. Mr. Gibbs, the butler, lay dead on his narrow bed, a knife buried in his chest. Blood stained his waistcoat and the chalices. Key, usually pinned to his pocket, was gone. Inspector Harrow, summoned from the village, knelt by the body, his face grim. "Murder," he declared, his voice cutting through the gasps. The room, lit by flickering lamps, smelled of wax and iron, and Miss Marple, her shawl tight, examined the scene. A smudged footprint, too small for a man's, marked the floorboards, and a curtain fluttered by an open window, its latch broken. The knife, its handle carved with a Langley crest, was from the dining room, a detail Harrow noted with a frown. Miss Marple questioned Agnes, the maid, who stood weeping in the doorway. "Mr. Gibbs was worried, miss," she said, her voice choked. kept saying someone was watching ever since the chalice went. His room, tidy but sparse, held a locked box, which Harrow opened to find letters from a London creditor hinting at Langley debts. The letters, addressed to Sir Rupert, suggested Gibbs knew of the family's ruin, a dangerous knowledge. The household was in chaos. Eleanor collapsed in a chair, her sobs echoing while Sir Rupert raged. His fists clenched. "Find the killer," he shouted, his voice slurred with brandy. Clara, pale as the moonlight, stood apart, her shawl clutched tightly, while Victor, composed, offered condolences, his eyes flicking to the library. Dr. Mortimer, still weak, suggested the chalice's curse, a theory Harrow dismissed but Miss Marple considered. Gibbs, as the key's keeper, had been a gatekeeper, perhaps silenced for what he knew. Miss Marple, kneeling by the window, found a thread caught on the sill, its blue weave matching Clara's shawl. The footprint, she noted, was delicate, perhaps a woman's, and her thoughts turned to Clara's fear and Victor's calm. At breakfast, the dining room was silent, the clink of cutlery stark against the tension. Harrow questioned the staff, learning Gibbs had locked the quarters at 10, meaning the killer was inside or knew the hall's secrets. Miss Marple, eating her toast, observed Clara's trembling hands and Victor's smooth reassurances, her mind on the thread. That afternoon, she walked to the stables where the attack on Mortimer had occurred. The mud, now dry, held no new clues, but the memory of the pearl button lingered. In the library, she found Clara's notebook, its pages open to a sketch of the vault's door, labeled "The Guardian's Gate." The phrase, paired with the journal's mention of a vow, suggested Gibbs's role was more than custodial. Had he guarded the true chalice, or its secret? As dusk fell, Miss Marple sat in the conservatory, its glass walls steaming with warmth. Her knitting needles clicked as she pieced together the clues, the footprint, the thread, the missing key. The murder, she sensed, was no random act but a desperate move to silence a witness. Clara's presence in the quarters, Victor's prowling, and Rupert's temper were threads in a web, their pattern tied to the vault. Her thoughts turned to a St. Mary Mead murder where a servant's knowledge had cost her life, and she wondered if Gibbs's loyalty had been his undoing. Chapter 7. The Village Whispers. Mary's Hollow awoke to a drizzle, its cobblestone streets slick and gleaming. Miss Jane Marple, her umbrella shielding her from the rain, walked to the village, seeking clarity amid the hall's chaos. The murder of Mr. Gibbs had sent ripples through the community, and the Rose and Crown tea shop was abuzz with whispers. Mrs. Finch, pouring chamomile tea, leaned close, her eyes wide. "Sir Rupert's debts are the talk of London," she said, her voice low. And Eleanor's husband, mad for that chalice, spent everything chasing its secrets. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking, encouraged the gossip, learning of Rupert's gambling and Eleanor's strained marriage. Mrs. Finch mentioned a vault, rumored to hold treasures beyond the chalice, a tale echoed by Mr. Tate, the historian. At his cottage, Miss Marple pored over his chronicles, their pages detailing the Langleys' medieval dealings. A sketch of the vault, labeled "The Knight's Keep," matched the journal's carvings, and Mr. Tate spoke of a guardian, a rule, passed through generations. "Gibbs might have known," he said, his voice hushed, "and paid for it." Back at the hall, Inspector Harrow reported no fingerprints on the knife, but Agnes had seen Clara near the servants' quarters before. The murder. Confronted, Clara claimed she'd been fetching a book, her voice trembling. Miss Marple, in the drawing room, observed her fear, noting Victor's attempt to soothe her, his hand lingering on her arm. Dr. Mortimer, now mobile, avoided questions. About the vault, his bandage stark against his pallor. The village's stories painted a picture of greed and fear, and Miss Marple, sipping tea, considered their weight. Rupert's debts, Eleanor's loyalty, and Clara's sketches suggested motives. But Gibbs's death was a warning, its brutality a sign of desperation. In the library, she found a misplaced book, its pages open to a tale of Sir Alaric's curse. The words underlined in fresh ink. The mark, she sensed, was deliberate, perhaps Clara's or Victor's, a clue to their knowledge. That evening, the household gathered in the conservatory, where Eleanor's piano notes faltered under the strain. Rupert, pacing, demanded Harrow's progress, while Victor offered to trace the chalice through his contacts. Miss Marple, knitting by the ferns, watched their interplay, her thoughts on the guardian. Gibbs's murder, she mused, was tied to the vault's secret, its shadow stretching across the Langley legacy. Chapter 8. The art dealer's game Victor Crane's charm was a polished mask, but Miss Jane Marple saw its cracks. In the orchard, where apples littered the grass, she invited him for a walk, her umbrella shielding them from a light rain. "You're quite the expert, Mr. Crane," she said, her voice mild. "What draws you to the chalice?" Victor, his smile unwavering, spoke of its rarity, but his answers grew vague when she mentioned Clara's notebook. "She's a clever girl," he said, "but naive about value." Miss Marple, noting his deflection, pressed further, learning. He'd met Clara at an auction where a Langley heirloom sold for thousands. "You seem well acquainted," she said, her eyes sharp. Victor's smile faltered, and he admitted offering to fund her research, a deal Miss Marple sensed was less generous than it seemed. In the library, she found Clara's notebook, its pages open to a sketch of a false chalice, the note suggesting the stolen goblet was a decoy. The discovery, paired with Victor's interest, pointed to a deeper game at dinner. Sir Rupert accused Victor of orchestrating the theft, his voice thick with wine. "You're a vulture, Crane," he shouted, his glass shattering on the floor. Victor's cool denial, paired with an offer to trace the chalice, deepened Miss Marple's suspicions. As rain lashed the windows, she explored the library, finding a hidden compartment in the fireplace. Inside was a map, its ink fresh, marking a folly in the woods, a place unmentioned by the Langleys. Harrow, shown the map, questioned Victor, who claimed ignorance, his smile strained. Miss Marple, knitting by the fire, recalled a St. Mary Mead swindler whose charm masked theft. Victor's game, she sensed, was tied to the vault, his charm a tool to manipulate Clara and outwit Rupert. The map, she mused, was a key, its markings. A guide to the chalice's twin or a trap for the unwary. Chapter 9. The Folly's Secret. Woods encircling Langley Hall were a realm of shadow and silence, their ancient oaks draped in mist that clung to the earth like a shroud. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl bundled against the autumn chill, ventured into this wilderness with Inspector Harrow, their steps muffled by a carpet of fallen leaves. The map found in the library's fireplace had marked a folly, a crumbling tower hidden deep in the estate's forest, and Miss Marple's curiosity, sharpened by the chalice's theft and Gibbs's murder, drove her to uncover its secrets. Harrow, his lantern swinging, cast a wary eye on the tangled brambles, his city-bred unease evident. "This place feels cursed," he muttered, his breath clouding in the cold, barely discernible, wound through gnarled roots and mossy stones, the air thick with the scent of pine and decay. Miss Marple, her sensible shoes steady on the uneven ground, recalled a St. Mary Mead ramble where a hidden shed had concealed a thief's loot. The folly, she sensed, was no mere ruin but a stage, its isolation perfect for secrets. After a half-hour's trek, the tower emerged from the mist, its weathered stones cloaked in ivy, its arched doorway gaping like a silent mouth. The structure, once a whimsy of some long-dead Langley, now sagged under time's weight, its windows shattered and its roof a patchwork of missing slates dot inside. The air was damp, the floor strewn with leaves and debris. Harrow's lantern revealed signs of recent intrusion. Cigarette stubs, their filters stained with lipstick, and a crumpled scrap of paper bearing Victor Crane's elegant scrawl, a list of London. Auction houses circled in red ink. Miss Marple, kneeling carefully, pocketed the paper, her fingers brushing a faint groove in the floorboards. "Someone's been here," she said, her voice soft but firm, and not for nostalgia. Harrow, inspecting the stubs, noted their brand French. Expensive, matching those Victor smoked. The evidence, though circumstantial, tightened the net around the art dealer Dot as they explored. Miss Marple's eye caught an irregularity in the floor, a trapdoor, its edges concealed by dust and leaves. Harrow, with a grunt, pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air from below was colder, carrying a metallic tang, and Miss Marple's knitting bag felt suddenly heavy at her side, its needles a quiet promise of order amid chaos. They descended, the lantern's light dancing on stone walls, carved with faint runes, echoes of the vault's medieval symbols. At the stair's base, a small chamber opened, its center dominated by a stone pedestal. There, gleaming in the dim light, sat the Crimson Chalice, its rubies winking like blood drops. Its gold UNTHHED. Harrow gasped, but Miss Marple, stepping closer, examined the goblet with a critical eye. Its craftsmanship was flawless, the rubies too bright, the gold too smooth for a relic of centuries. "A replica," she murmured, her fingers tracing its rim. "The true chalice bears the scars of time. This is a decoy, placed to mislead." Harrow, frowning, lifted the goblet, its weight confirming her words. As he did, a rustle echoed above, followed by the snap of a twig. Miss Marple's head snapped up, her senses sharp. "Someone's watching," she whispered, and Harrow, drawing his whistle, rushed to the trapdoor. A figure, cloaked in shadow, fled through the Follies' doorway, their footsteps swallowed by the woods. Harrow gave chase, his lantern bobbing, but the mist and trees shielded the intruder, their form too swift to pursue. Miss Marple, remaining in the chamber, scanned its walls, finding scratches near the pedestal, as if the chalice had been placed hastily. A single petal, wilted but fresh, lay in a corner a rose, its hue matching those in Clara Beaumont's garden sketch. The petal, she noted, was no accident, its presence a thread linking the folly to the hall's intrigues. Back at Langley Hall, the household gathered in the library, the air thick with tension. Miss Marple, with Harrow's consent, revealed the chalice's recovery, holding it aloft for all to see. Eleanor gasped, her hands clasping, while Sir Rupert's face darkened, his fists clenched. Clara, pale as parchment, stared at the goblet, her glasses fogging with unshed tears. Victor, lounging by the fireplace, offered a slow clap, his smile razor-sharp. "Well done, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth. "Shall I authenticate it? I know a buyer in Paris." His eagerness, Miss Marple noted, was a tell, his eyes lingering on the chalice with a hunger that belied his calm, Dr. Mortimer. His bandage fresh, muttered about the curse, his hands trembling as he sipped brandy. "It's doomed us all," he said, his voice barely audible. Miss Marple, setting the chalice on the table, kept the Follies' location secret, her instincts warning her the thief would return. She watched Clara, whose fingers twisted her shawl, and Victor, whose gaze flicked to the historian, a silent communication she couldn't yet decipher. Harrow, stationed by the door, announced plans to guard the chalice, but Miss Marple knew. Its recovery was a feint, designed to flush out the true prize. That evening, she walked the hall's corridors, her candle casting shadows on the portraits. The Langley ancestors, their eyes stern, seemed to guard their secrets, and Miss Marple paused by Lord Edmund's painting, his hand resting on a goblet eerily like the chalice. A faint scratch on the frame caught her eye, mirroring those in the Follies' chamber. Someone, she realized, had searched here. Perhaps Victor, whose cigarette stubs marked the woods, or Clara, whose petal hinted at her presence. In the drawing room, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking as the household dispersed. Eleanor, pale but resolute, spoke of preserving the Langley name, while Rupert, nursing a whiskey, muttered about debts. Clara, avoiding Miss Marple's gaze, slipped away, her shawl trailing. Victor, offering to fetch tea, lingered by the library door, his smile a mask. Miss Marple, sipping chamomile, pieced together the clues, the replica's placement, Victor's scrawl, Clara's petal, and the fleeing figure. The folly, she sensed, was a stage, set to distract from the vault's deeper secrets. Its true chalice hidden in shadow. As night fell, she explored the gardens, the moon silvering the roses. A rustle in the hedge drew her, but it was only a cat, its eyes glinting. The Follies' chamber, she mused, was a trap, its chalice a lure for the greedy or desperate. Clara's fear, Victor's charm, and Rupert's temper were threads in a tapestry, their pattern tied to the vault's guardian. Her knitting resumed in her room, the needle's rhythm a counterpoint to her thoughts. The figure in the woods, she wondered, was it Clara, driven by debt, or Victor, chasing profit? Or was another player, unseen, pulling the strings? The chalice's secret, she knew, was close, its truth buried in the Langley Pass. Chapter 9. The Follies' Secret. Woods encircling Langley Hall were a realm of shadow and silence, their ancient oaks draped in mist that clung to the earth like a shroud. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl bundled against the autumn chill, ventured into this wilderness with Inspector Harrow, their steps muffled by a carpet of fallen leaves. The map found in the library's fireplace had marked a folly, a crumbling tower hidden deep in the estate's forest, and Miss Marple's curiosity, sharpened by the chalice's theft and Gibbs's murder, drove her to uncover its secrets. Harrow, his lantern swinging, cast a wary eye on the tangled brambles, his city-bred unease evident. "This place feels cursed," he muttered, his breath clouding in the cold, barely discernible, wound through gnarled roots and mossy stones, the air thick with the scent of pine and decay. Miss Marple, her sensible shoes steady on the uneven ground, recalled a St. Mary Mead ramble where a hidden shed had concealed a thief's loot. The folly, she sensed, was no mere ruin but a stage, its isolation perfect for secrets. After a half-hour's trek, the tower emerged from the mist, its weathered stones cloaked in ivy, its arched doorway gaping like a silent mouth. The structure, once a whimsy of some long-dead Langley, now sagged under time's weight, its windows shattered and its roof a patchwork of missing slates. Inside, the air was damp, the floor strewn with leaves and debris. Harrow's lantern revealed signs of recent intrusion, cigarette stubs, their filters stained with lipstick, and a crumpled scrap of paper bearing Victor Crane's elegant scrawl, a list of London auction houses circled in red ink. Miss Marple, kneeling carefully, pocketed the paper, her fingers brushing a faint groove in the floorboards. "Someone's been here," she said, her voice soft but firm, and not for nostalgia. Harrow, inspecting the stubs, noted their brand French, expensive, matching those Victor smoked. The evidence, though circumstantial, tightened the net around the art dealer. As they explored, Miss Marple's eye caught an irregularity in the floor, a trapdoor, its edges concealed by dust and leaves. Harrow, with a grunt, pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air from below was colder, carrying a metallic tang, and Miss Marple's knitting bag felt suddenly heavy at her side, its needles a quiet promise of order amid chaos. They descended, the lantern's light dancing on stone walls, carved with faint runes, echoes of the vault's medieval symbols. At the stairs' base, a small chamber opened, its center dominated by a stone pedestal. There, gleaming in the dim light, sat the Crimson Chalice, its rubies winking like blood drops. Its gold Harrow gasped, but Miss Marple, stepping closer, examined the goblet with a critical eye. Its craftsmanship was flawless, the rubies too bright, the gold too smooth for a relic of centuries. A replica, she murmured, her fingers tracing its rim. The true chalice bears the scars of time. This is a decoy, placed to mislead. Harrow, frowning, lifted the goblet, its weight confirming her words. As he did, a rustle echoed above, followed by the snap of a twig. Miss Marple's head snapped up, her senses sharp. "Someone's watching," she whispered, and Harrow, drawing his whistle, rushed to the trapdoor. A figure, cloaked in shadow, fled through the Follies' doorway, their footsteps swallowed by the woods. Harrow gave chase, his lantern bobbing, but the mist and trees shielded the intruder, their form too swift to pursue. Miss Marple, remaining in the chamber, scanned its walls, finding scratches near the pedestal, as if the chalice had been placed hastily. A single petal, wilted but fresh, lay in a corner a rose, its hue matching those in Clara Beaumont's garden sketch. The petal, she noted, was no accident, its presence a thread linking the folly to the hall's intrigues. Back at Langley Hall, the household gathered in the library, the air thick with tension. Miss Marple, with Harrow's consent, revealed the chalice's recovery, holding it aloft for all to see. Eleanor gasped, her hands clasping, while Sir Rupert's face darkened, his fists clenched. Clara, pale as parchment, stared at the goblet, her glasses fogging with unshed tears. Victor, lounging by the fireplace, offered a slow clap, his smile razor-sharp. "Well done, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth. "Shall I authenticate it? I know a buyer in Paris." His eagerness, Miss Marple noted, was a tell, his eyes lingering on the chalice with a hunger that belied his calm. Dr. Mortimer, his bandage fresh, muttered about the curse, his hands trembling as he sipped brandy. "It's doomed us all," he said, his voice barely audible. Miss Marple, setting the chalice on the table, kept the Follies' location secret, her instincts warning her the thief would return. She watched Clara, whose fingers twisted her shawl, and Victor, whose gaze flicked to the historian, a silent communication she couldn't yet decipher. Harrow, stationed by the door, announced plans to guard the chalice, but Miss Marple knew. Its recovery was a feint, designed to flush out the true prize. That evening, she walked the hall's corridors, her candle casting shadows on the portraits. The Langley ancestors, their eyes stern, seemed to guard their secrets, and Miss Marple paused by Lord Edmund's painting, his hand resting on a goblet eerily like the chalice. A faint scratch on the frame caught her eye, mirroring those in the Follies' chamber. Someone, she realized, had searched here, perhaps Victor, whose cigarette stubs marked the woods, or Clara, whose petal hinted at her presence. In the drawing room, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking as the household dispersed. Eleanor, pale but resolute, spoke of preserving the Langley name, while Rupert, nursing a whiskey, muttered about debts. Clara, avoiding Miss Marple's gaze, slipped away, her shawl trailing. Victor, offering to fetch tea, lingered by the library door, his smile a mask. Miss Marple, sipping chamomile, pieced together the clues, the replica's placement, Victor's scrawl, Clara's petal, and the fleeing figure. The folly, she sensed, was a stage, set to distract from the vault's deeper secrets. Its true chalice hidden in shadow. As night fell, she explored the gardens, the moon silvering the roses. A rustle in the hedge drew her, but it was only a cat, its eyes glinting. The Follies' chamber, she mused, was a trap, its chalice a lure for the greedy or desperate. Clara's fear, Victor's charm, and Rupert's temper were threads in a tapestry, their pattern tied to the vault's guardian. Her knitting resumed in her room, the needle's rhythm a counterpoint to her thoughts. The figure in the woods, she wondered, was it Clara, driven by debt, or Victor, chasing profit? Or was another player, unseen, pulling the strings? The chalice's secret, she knew, was close, its truth buried in the Langley Pass. Chapter 11. The confession. Sir Rupert Langley's confession hung over Langley Hall like a storm cloud, its weight crushing the fragile unity of the household. In the drawing room, where portraits of stern ancestors glowered from the walls, Rupert sat slumped in an armchair, his hands trembling as he clutched a half-empty whiskey glass. The fire's glow cast harsh shadows on his face, etching lines of despair that aged him beyond his years. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the hearth, her shawl draped over her shoulders, watched him with a mixture of pity and resolve, her knitting, needles still in her lap. The room, heavy with the scent of wood smoke and wax, was silent save for Eleanor's quiet sobs and the distant creak of the hall's ancient timbers. Rupert's voice, when he spoke, was a broken whisper, each word dragged from a well of shame. It was the debts, he said, his eyes fixed on the flames. Carts, horses, bad investments, they piled up year after year. The estate was bleeding, and I couldn't let it go. The Langleys were nothing without this hall. He paused, his glass trembling, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of pride in his eyes, a spark drowned by desperation. Gibbs overheard me on the telephone, talking to a creditor. He was loyal, but curious, kept asking if I'd sell the chalice. I couldn't risk him talking. Eleanor, seated on a velvet sofa, buried her face in her hands, her silver hair falling loose. Rupert, how could you? She whispered, her voice choked. Gibbs was family, he served us for decades. Her words, sharp with betrayal, cut through the room, and Rupert flinched, his glass slipping to the rug, its amber contents staining the weave. Miss Marple, her gaze steady, spoke softly. And so, Sir Rupert, you acted. The knife from the dining room, the polish from your study, small mistakes, but telling. Rupert nodded, his shoulders sagging. It was late, he said, his voice barely audible. I went to his room, thought I'd reason with him, but he was stubborn, said he'd tell Eleanor. I lost control. The knife was there, on his table, and before I knew it, he trailed off, tears streaking his face, and Miss Marple's heart ached for the man who'd let greed and fear undo him. The footprint, she'd explained, had misled her at first, its small size suggesting a woman, but Rupert's boots, worn thin, matched the mark, a detail confirmed by Harrow's men. Inspector Harrow, standing by the door, scribbled in his notebook, his face grim but professional. You planned to frame Mr. Crane, he said, his voice formal. The map in the fireplace, the Folly's chalice, your work, to shift blame. Rupert's head bowed, his silence an admission. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, elaborated, her tone gentle but firm. The map was your design, sir? Rupert, to hide the replica and suggest Victor's guilt. But the polish on the knife, the wax in your study, it betrayed you. You polished your boots there, didn't you, after the rain? Rupert's nod was barely perceptible, his voice a whisper. I thought I could save us, he said. The chalice, the replica, it was worth enough to clear the debts. I hid it in the Folly, planned to sell it quietly, but Gibbs, his words faltered, and Miss Marple, sipping tea, reflected on the tragedy of loyalty twisted by desperation. The Langley legacy, she mused, was not in its relics but in its people, now fractured by Rupert's crime. Eleanor rose, her face pale but resolute, and faced Miss Marple. Jane, what do we do now? She asked, her voice trembling. The shame it'll ruin us. Miss Marple, taking her hand, offered a quiet smile. The truth, Eleanor, is a heavy burden, but it cleanses. You'll rebuild not on gold, but on honesty. Her words, simple but profound, seemed to steady Eleanor, who nodded, her eyes glistening. Harrow, with a nod to his men, escorted Rupert from the room, his steps heavy on the polished floor. The household dispersed, Clara Beaumont slipping away, her face wet with tears, and Victor Crane, his charms stripped, awaiting his own reckoning. Dr. Mortimer, his bandage a stark reminder of his brush with danger, sat silently, his obsession. With the chalice broken, Miss Marple, lingering by the fire, watched the flames, her thoughts on the clues that had unraveled the mystery, the footprint, the polish, the map, each a thread in a tapestry of greed and regret. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked the gardens, the air sharp with frost. The roses, wilting under autumn's touch, mirrored the Langleys' decline, yet their roots held firm, a promise of renewal. She found Clara by the fountain, her notebook clutched tightly, and offered a gentle word. "You've a chance, my dear," she said, "to make right your wrongs." Clara, her glasses fogging, nodded, her voice soft. "I'll try, Miss Marple. I never meant for this." Her remorse, Miss Marple sensed, was genuine, a seed of redemption in the wreckage dot in the conservatory. Miss Marple sat with Eleanor, the glass walls steaming with warmth. Over tea, they spoke of the future, Eleanor's resolve strengthening. With each word, "I'll open the hall," she said, "share its history, not its secrets." Miss Marple, her knitting resuming, nodded, her needles a steady rhythm. The chalice's legacy, she mused, was its truths, forced into the light by Rupert's crime and Clara's confession. Victor's trial, looming in London, would close his chapter. His cunning no match for Justice Dodd as dusk fell. Miss Marple walked the corridors, her candle casting shadows on the portraits. The Langley ancestors, their eyes stern, seemed less forbidding now, their secrets laid bare. In her room, she spread the map, its ink a testament to Rupert's folly, and wondered if the true chalice still lay in the vault, its guardian gone. Her knitting needles clicked, a counterpoint to her thoughts. The confession, she knew, was not the end, but a beginning, its echoes shaping St. Mary's Hollow for years to come. Chapter 12. The Village Healst. Mary's Hollow awoke to a crisp dawn, its cobblestone streets gleaming under a sky cleared of autumn's gloom. Miss Jane Marple, her suitcase packed, walked through the village, her umbrella tucked under her arm, her knitting bag swinging gently. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and baking bread, and the villagers, sweeping their stoops or tending market stalls, nodded as she passed, their smiles warm with gratitude. The shadow of Langley Hall's crimes, Gibbs's murder, the chalice's theft had lifted, and St. Mary's Hollow was stirring with cautious hope, its spirit resilient despite the scandal dot at the Rose and Crown. Mrs. Finch poured chamomile tea, her apron crisp and her eyes bright. "You've saved us, Miss Marple," she said, setting a plate of scones on the table. The village was holding its breath, what with the murder and all. "Now we can breathe again." Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking, smiled, her thoughts on the gossip that had guided her, Rupert's debts, the chalice's curse, the vault's secrets. Mrs. Finch, leaning close, shared news, the true Crimson Chalice, verified by a London expert, had been donated to a museum, its legend drawing tourists to the village. "They're coming from miles away," she said, "and the tea shop's never been busier." Miss Marple, sipping tea, walked to the churchyard, where the village's history lay etched in weathered stones. The graves of past Langleys, their names moss-covered, spoke of a legacy both proud and burdened. She paused by a marker for Sir Alaric, the betrayed knight, its inscription faded but legible, "Cursed be those who break faith." The words, echoing Clara's research, reminded her of the chalice's power not magical, but human, its secrets driving men to ruin. A child, playing nearby, offered her a daisy, and Miss Marple, tucking it into her shawl, felt the village's pulse, its healing a mirror to St. Mary Mead's quiet strength. Back at Langley Hall, Eleanor Langley was a changed woman, her silver hair pinned neatly, her eyes clear with purpose. She greeted Miss Marple in the drawing room, where sunlight streamed through the windows, banishing the gloom. "I've decided to open the hall," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "Tours, lectures let the world see our history, not our shame." She gestured to a table where plans for a museum wing lay spread, its centerpiece the vault's relics, sans the chalice. Miss Marple, nodding, admired her resolve, seeing in Eleanor the strength to rebuild. Clara Beaumont, no longer the trembling historian, joined them, her notebook replaced by a letter of acceptance to a university program. "Dr. Mortimer's mentoring me," she said, her glasses polished, her smile shy. "I want to study honestly, no more shortcuts." Mortimer, his bandage gone, stood by the window, his obsession with curses replaced by a quiet passion for teaching. "She's got potential," he said, his voice gruff but kind. Miss Marple, her knitting needles pausing, saw in Clara a chance for redemption, her debts a lesson rather than a chain. Victor Crane's fate reported. Miss Marple, sipping tea, read the London papers, where headlines detailed his trial for theft and assault. His charm, once a weapon, had failed him, his contacts abandoning him as evidence mounted. The Folly cigarette stubs, the auction list, the attack on Mortimer, each a nail in his downfall. Miss Marple, turning the pages, felt no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction that justice, slow but sure, had prevailed. The village, she knew, would move on, its wounds healing as tourists flocked to see the chalice's story. Now a tale of truth rather than mystery. At the station, Miss Marple waited for the train, her suitcase at her side, her knitting bag heavy with yarn. The platform, bustling with villagers and visitors, hummed with life, and she smiled, seeing St. Mary's Hollow's future in their faces. The train's whistle sounded, its smoke curling into the sky, and she boarded, her thoughts on Langley Hall. Its towers, softened by morning light, stood as a testament to resilience, their secrets no longer a burden but a bridge to renewal. In her compartment, Miss Marple opened her knitting, the needle's rhythm a familiar comfort. The Langley case, she mused, was a tapestry of human frailty, greed, fear, loyalty woven with care. Its lessons of trust and redemption would linger, much like St. Mary Mead's quiet wisdom. As the countryside rolled by, she tucked the daisy into her bag, a token of the village's healing, its simplicity a balm after the hall's intrigues. The mystery was solved, its threads unraveled, and St. Mary's Hollow, like her own village, would endure, its heart beating strong. Chapter 13. Reflections at St. Mary Med. The train from St. Mary's Hollow rattled through the countryside, its rhythm a soothing counterpoint to Miss Jane Marple's thoughts. Back in St. Mary Mead, she settled into her cottage, its rose-covered walls a sanctuary after the turmoil of Langley Hall. The scent of lavender and wood polish filled the air, and her parlor, with its chintz curtains and well-worn rugs, welcomed her like an old friend. She lit the fire, its crackle warming the room, and set her knitting bag on the table, the needles gleaming in the lamplight. The Langley case lingered in her mind, its intricacies a mirror to the human heart. She wrote to Eleanor Langley, her pen scratching softly, offering advice on rebuilding trust with the village. "Share your story," she wrote, "not as shame, but as strength. The truth once faced becomes a foundation." Sealing the letter, she pictured Eleanor's resolve, her plans to open the hall, and felt a quiet pride in her friend's courage. Her nephew, Raymond West, arrived for tea, his writer's curiosity alight. Over scones and jam, Miss Marple recounted the case, her voice weaving a tale of greed and redemption. The Crimson Chalice, she explained, was no mere relic but a symbol, its twin hidden to guard the Langley legacy. Gibbs's murder, Rupert's desperation, Clara's debts, Victor's cunning, each a thread in a tapestry of human frailty. Raymond, scribbling notes, suggested a novel, his eyes bright. "It's a cracking story, Aunt Jane," he said, full of twists. She demurred, her smile wry. "Life writes better stories than I could, Raymond. I only untangle them." In her garden, Miss Marple tended her roses, their petals soft under her fingers. The chalice's power, she mused, was not in its rubies, but in its secrets, forcing truths into the light. Rupert's shame, Clara's remorse, Victor's fall each reflected frailties she'd seen in St. Mary Mead, where gossip and kindness coexisted. The village, untouched by the Langley drama, was a sanctuary, its rhythms, church bells, market days. Neighbors chatter a balm after the hall's intrigues. That evening, she walked to the vicarage, where Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, hosted a knitting circle. The women, their needles clicking, shared village news: a new baby, a broken fence, a lost cat found. Miss Marple, joining them, felt the case's weight lift, its lessons blending with St. Mary Mead's wisdom. The chalice, she reflected, was like gossip, a spark that could destroy or illuminate, depending on its wielder. Back home, she sat by the window, watching dust settle over the village. The Langley mystery was a puzzle, its pieces scattered but now whole. Her knitting resumed, the needle's rhythm a steady pulse, a reminder that even the most tangled threads could be unraveled with patience. She pictured Clara, studying anew, and Eleanor, opening the hall, their futures shaped by truth. St. Mary Mead, with its quiet strength, was her anchor, its simplicity a testament to the endurance of small places and sharp minds. Chapter 14. The final thread on crisp evening in St. Mary Mead. A parcel arrived at Miss Jane Marple's cottage, its brown paper tied with twine. Inside was a miniature crimson chalice, its rubies replaced with glass, a delicate replica that caught the firelight. A letter from Eleanor Langley accompanied it, detailing St. Mary's Hollow's progress. The village thrived, its tea shops bustling with tourists drawn to the chalice's legend. Clara Beaumont had earned a scholarship, her studies honest now, guided by Dr. Mortimer's steady hand. Langley Hall's tours were a success, Eleanor wrote, its history a bridge to renewal rather than a burden. Miss Marple placed the replica on her mantel, its gleam a quiet trophy of her work. She sat by the fire, her knitting needles clicking, and traced the case's threads. Rupert's desperation, his confession a wound to the Langley name. Clara's redemption, her tears a step toward grace. Victor's fall, his charm no match for justice. The chalice, she mused, was a catalyst, its secrets forcing the Langleys to face their past. Much as St. Mary Mead's gossip revealed its truth, the village outside her window was settling into night, its lights twinkling like stars. Church bells chimed, their notes carrying over the lanes, and Miss Marple pictured her neighbors, Mrs. Price at the vicarage, Mr. Stringer at the shop, children playing by the stream. Their lives, simple but rich, mirrored St. Mary's Hollow's healing, a testament to the strength of small communities. The Langley case, she reflected, was a tapestry of ambition and regret, its threads woven with care, each clue the footprint, the map, the petal a stitch in the pattern. She walked to her garden, the air sharp with frost, and tended her roses, their scent lingering. The chalice's twin, she wondered, did it still lie in the vault, its guardian gone? The question, unanswered, was less pressing than the truths it had revealed. Rupert's crime, Clara's confession, Eleanor's resolve, these were the cases. Hard, their stories a lesson in human frailty and resilience. Back inside, she spread Eleanor's letter, its words a bridge between villages, and felt a kinship with St. Mary's Hollow, its recovery a mirror to her own home. Her knitting resumed, the needle's rhythm a counterpoint to her thoughts. The Langley mystery was solved, its echoes shaping futures far beyond the hall. She pictured tourists at the museum, gazing at the true chalice, its rubies a spark of wonder, and smiled, knowing its story was now a gift, not a curse. St. Mary. Mead, with its quiet routines, grounded her, its simplicity a fitting end to the tale. As the fire died to embers, Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes on the replica. Another mystery would come, as they always did, drawn by human nature's endless dance of light and shadow. For now, the peace of her village was enough, its heart a steady beat, its lessons woven into the fabric of her days. The Crimson Chalice, once a secret, was now a beacon, its truth a thread that bound St. Mary's Hollow to St. Mary Mead. Two villages united by the quiet power of understanding.